In today's video, we're going to talk about presentation logic versus application logic versus domain logic. We're going to classify what counts as each logical component and where it actually sits in the codebase. If you're new to the channel, then welcome. My name is Amichai, and in this channel, I talk about software architecture, design patterns, things that you want to be familiar with if you're a software engineer. This video is part 6 in a series in which we're building a REST API completely from scratch, following ASP.NET 8, various best practices, etc. So if you don't want to miss out on future videos as they come out, then make sure to smash the subscribe button. In any case, this video can be watched standalone from the overall series. Okay, so when we talk about the different logical components in our system, we're basically asking ourselves, what type of code sits where in our project? Now, this can mean different parts in a single file. This can mean different files in a specific folder, or this can mean different projects altogether. This can mean different microservices. The separation is logical and not necessarily physical. Now, the reason why we want to have a separation between different types of code is for us to be able to say, okay, this type of decisions or this type of logic sits in a specific part. And then when I want to know where something is implemented, then I can simply say, okay, there's this domain folder, then likely business decisions will be made within these files. So again, it allows us to reason about our code if the code follows a specific structure. But not only that, so if we make sure to put specific type of logic in specific places, then with time, as the project grows, then we don't end up with God methods that involve all the logic of a specific action that needs to take place. So for example, if we're looking at the products controller and we're looking at the create product endpoint, then keeping a clear separation, make sure that this method over here doesn't become a God method where it has everything from receiving the data to manipulating the database to doing various business checks, etc. We know that we have a clear separation, and this way parts of our system grow in a more organized way. Okay, so that's a bit of motivation. Now let's talk about the actual classification of each logical component. Now, real quick before we continue, I want to remind you that if you want to join our amazing Discord community, then you can do it for the price of a cup of coffee. Instead of buying the next cup of coffee, you should invest in my Patreon, and then not only will you join our Discord server, but also you'll get access to the source code of this video and every other video on this channel. Enough self-promotion, now back to the video. So if we look at our system as sort of an onion, then in the outmost part, then we have the presentation logic, in which we have the logic that has to do with interacting with the user. So when the user makes a request or when the user clicks a button on a web page, then they're interacting with the presentation logic. Other than presentation logic, we also have the logic that has to do with the various business decisions that we're doing, with orchestrating the various objects in our system. That will happen in inner parts of our system or in inner components in our system, where basically what we have is we have another circle inside, which we can simply call the core of our application. And the presentation logic will be responsible to invoke or orchestrate the objects in the inner components. So if this sounds a bit amorphic, then I want to give you an example. So let's say we go ahead and we want to create a product. So the user will go ahead and interact with the presentation layer and they'll create a product. The presentation layer won't be the one that actually creates the product, but it will be responsible for receiving the actual request and invoking the corresponding logic in the core of the application. Now, what this actually looks like, so over here we have the create endpoint, then it looks just like this. So we have the presentation layer and it invokes the correct logic in the application component. Another reason why this separation is good is because now that we have the product service working with the product, where the product is also part of the core of the application, then we can theoretically update our API and update the technology that we're using for interacting with the user. We can update this from MVC to GraphQL to gRPC, and all we need to do is to invoke this create method in the application component, which will go ahead and do the same action for us. And that way we don't couple the technology that we're using to interact with the user to the actual logic of our application. Okay, so that's the presentation logic. Should be pretty intuitive, everything that has to do with interactions with the outside world. Now we have the application logic and the domain logic. So like we said, the presentation logic is responsible to invoke the application and domain logic, also known together as the core logic of our application. In the case of creating a product, this is invoking the create method. But this, as you can imagine, can be invoking the get product method. This can be the create review method, get top reviews, get average rating of the product in the past 3 days. All of this can be things that are invoked by the presentation layer. Now, classifying what part of that core logic is considered application logic and what is considered domain logic, then let's look at the following example. Let's imagine that each user can go ahead and create a maximum of 3 products. This means that alongside the details that we have currently, we also need over here the user ID. So let's go ahead and say user ID. And also for this, we need to imagine that we have some users. Let's say that each one of the users alongside an ID also has a list of products. And this is going to be the products that are created by this specific user, which means that what we can have over here is the following. Alongside the product, let's also have here a list of user, and let's call this the users repository. So now the question is, where should we put the check whether or not the user is passing the maximum number of products? Should this be over here inside the product service? So saying something like user.products and checking that the count is not greater or equal to 3, for example. And if it is, then over here we'll return some error. Or instead, should we go ahead and say user.addProduct and pass it the product and have the logic contained inside the user object like so. So this question leads us to what is considered application logic and what is considered domain logic. So when we go ahead, for example, when we create a product, then there are various things that we need to do, right? So if we go ahead and look at the actual things that we need to do, then we need to fetch the user. We also need to fetch the product. We then need to check whether the user reached the maximum number of products allowed. Then we need to actually go ahead and save the user and also save the product, or more correctly, update the user and save the product. And here's what falls under application logic and what falls under domain logic. So anything that has to do with orchestrating the use case is application logic. So fetching the user, fetching the product, updating the user, and saving the product, this falls under application logic. Now, this doesn't mean that the application logic will be interacting with the database, but it's the application logic that will be invoking the corresponding logic. So for example, if each one of these was its own class, that wouldn't be considered application logic. This would be considered persistence logic. The application logic would be responsible to invoke the appropriate persistence logic as part of orchestrating the use case. Okay, now we still have this step over here, which we didn't classify yet. And this is what's referred to as domain logic. The various business rules, the various business decisions, knowledge, terminology, it all falls under the umbrella of the domain logic. And we want this type of decisions to sit inside the domain objects. So we looked at the 2 examples. One is to put the logic over here as part of this method. And the other one is simply to invoke a method on the user domain object. So based on what I just said, then what we prefer doing is putting the logic inside the domain object. So overall, what we have is the following. Inside the controllers, we put the presentation logic. Inside the services, we're going to be putting the application logic. And inside the domain, then we're going to put the domain logic. Now, as a rule of thumb, you want to have the following separation within your system. You want to have the presentation logic interacting with the application logic, but not the other way around. And you want the application logic interacting with the domain logic, but again, not the other way around. So going back to the circles that we looked at before, then you can look at it as having the following 3 circles. The outermost circle is the presentation logic, the inner layer is the application logic, and the innermost circle is the domain logic, which is why, if you remember from the previous video, then we had the create product request and the product response as part of the controller class, and this falls under the presentation logic. If you remember, then we had the conversion from the incoming request to the underlying product inside the create product request. So we had the presentation logic converting the request from the incoming request to the domain object. On the way out, then we had the product response being created based on the product domain object. The reason we had that is because we want to have these two objects know about the domain object, but not the other way around. So we don't want to tie the domain logic to the presentation logic by having the domain object convert itself to these objects. Now, if you're working with clean architecture, then what you're doing is you're taking each one of these logical components and you're putting it in its own project. And by defining the references between the projects, then you're ensuring that you won't be able to reference the symbols in the presentation logic from the domain logic. But because here we're working inside one assembly and all the symbols are available to all the other symbols, then this separation isn't as clear. And us as developers working on a project that's structured this way, then we need to simply know about these rules and enforce them in our codebase. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't be pragmatic and do things a bit differently in your application, but this is the general structure that I would recommend for you to follow if you're following this architecture. And what this allows you is to later take each one of these folders, and if you want to convert your project to clean architecture, then each one of these folders can later become its own layer. Now, something that often happens in projects that are structured this way is that at some point you see that you have, let's say, 15 controllers and 15 services where each one of the controllers only works with one of the services, and similarly only with one or two domain objects. When this is the case, then many times what you want to do is to take the current architecture, which is separation by concern. So we have the controllers, which is one concern inside its own folder. You may want to update your architecture to be more feature oriented, meaning that you'll have, for example, the products folder, and inside there, you may have the products controller, the products service, and the products domain object. Or alternatively, what I usually do is as this project grows and I'll convert it to working with clean architecture, then inside each one of the layers, then I'll follow a feature structure where, for example, in the application layer, the application project, then over there, I'll have folders by features. So for example, products, reviews, etc. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. In the next videos, then we'll be adding Docker support, we'll be adding Dapper to our application, and we'll be adding a Postgres database as well. So there's going to be a lot of interesting things coming up. So make sure to smash the subscribe button if you don't want to miss out on the future videos, and I'll see you there.